Hey there, everybody. This is Jay Frost speaking to you from, of course, the Philanthropy Mastermind series. Welcome back. It is great to have you here. And of course, I want to begin, I should say, thank our sponsor, DonorSearch, for providing a platform for the kinds of conversations we're going to have today, which not only inform us, but maybe challenge us a bit. And so you'll learn much more about that in just a second. And of course, I want to welcome you to be a part of that conversation rather than just sitting back. If you do want to just listen, that's fine. But if you do want to take an active role, you saw already in those slides that preceded my babbling here that you can do two things. And one is to use the chat. The other is to use the Q&A. We're going to be monitoring that throughout. So feel free to ask anything or say anything you want throughout, and we'll be paying attention as you do. And in fact, just to warm up that space, it would be really kind if you wouldn't mind just telling us maybe where you're here from, which organization, which part of the country, or perhaps the world. I just came out of another session a few minutes ago that DonorSearch was doing, and there were people from Kenya as well as North Carolina. So thank you, Jennifer, for starting us up. We've got Oakland, California. Nicole, oh, wow, good to see somebody from Michigan. Which part of Michigan? That does matter. It's a big place for those who pay attention to Michigan geography. Anyway, so we have San Antonio and, wow, Lansing, thank you. Atlanta, Rockport, Chicago, Fayetteville. Oh my gosh, I'm missing half of it here, but I appreciate you're doing it, and also lets everybody in a space, and especially our guest today, know where you're here from. And Tony, very nice to see you from Edmonton. Great to see you. Tony has been in the podcast series. Lots of great folks in this room, and we'll be really welcoming your participation in a conversation which I'm sure is going to be as interesting to you as it is to me, and largely because it's unscripted like everything we do. And today, the conversation is, of course, on navigating power dynamics in difficult donor situations. Even right there, it already raises some hackles and concerns, but those are the right kind to have. We have two people, count them two, who are going to be discussing this today, and I'll, of course, facilitate some of the questions, but hopefully sit back and learn along with you. Those are, of course, our guests, Robert Osborne, who is principal of the Osborne Group and has over 25 years in the profession. Prior to his role there at the firm, he has served as Director of Development for St. Aloysius School, Interfaith Neighbors, the Center for Constitutional Rights, among others. And he serves currently on the board, I believe currently, on the board of the United Hospital Fund in New York, the International Advisory Board of the Czech Fundraising Center, the International Advisory Board of the Impact Hub, Belgrade and Serbia, and the Advisory Board for Impact Hub right there in New York. And we also have Laurel McCombs, who is the Senior Philanthropy Advisor at the Osborne Group. She herself has over 20 years in the field and works with a whole wide variety of clients with the firm, ranging from La Clinica de la Raza to the Council of Michigan Foundation. So there is a Michigan theme here. That's accidental, though. Prior to joining the firm, she served at Big Brothers Big Sisters of America, among others. And the reason why we are having this conversation today is, I think, in part a credit to Karen Osborne, who's also been in the podcast series and a guest in Philanthropy Masterminds before, who's a good friend to all of us in this sector. I'd like to think a personal one as well, someone who we all admire. And she suggested that we invite these folks in to talk with us. And then they suggested this really interesting and sometimes thorny topic. So I'm going to stop talking now and invite Bob and Laurel to just maybe tell us what's the origin of this conversation. Why is this important to you? And maybe why now?
I'll jump in, Bob, since this really was kind of my it was my fault. We got involved in all of this in the first place. I will give a shout out to AFP Congress in Toronto, because in 2018 they actually, when they put out their call for proposals for Congress that year, they actually had done they proposed a tough topics track. And so not being one to shy away from a challenge, I kind of thought, well, gosh, what would I do if I was going to talk about a tough topic? What would that tough topic be? And of course, right in 2018, we were right in the thick of Me Too, and it was very much a topic of conversation, something that we were talking about with clients, something that was coming up in terms of how organizations were responding to that. And what occurred to me at the time was, as part of Me Too, we were very good. We were getting so much better at talking about the big things, right? Like very obvious cases of sexual harassment and very kind of, when things obviously kind of went against policies in our organizations, HR policies and things like that. But having been in this business for 20 plus years, I couldn't help but think of all of those little questionable things that maybe didn't totally violate a sexual harassment policy, but gosh, sure made me feel uncomfortable, right? That time when a donor just left his hand on the small of my back too long, or the time that somebody just made a comment about the way I looked or my age or my something that just left me feeling ugh, like just didn't sit right. And I thought, what about all of that stuff, right? When you aren't sure if I should take this to HR, right? I'm not going to escalate this necessarily internally, but I also don't want to just be left out there to not know how to deal with it. And so I proposed, and AFP Congress accepted a session on just like dealing with difficult donor situations and how do we deal with those? How do we know, first and foremost, when to escalate things to HR and more broadly, but also just how in the moment do I deal with those situations, and then how as follow-up do I deal with those situations. And so that was kind of the impetus for all of this. And in the last 6 years, I guess 5.5 years, it's really grown. And I think particularly after the murder of George Floyd, and the kind of the social and racial justice reckoning that we've gone through over the course of the last few years, it really has broadened to not just include things around like sexual harassment, but have included things like racial discrimination, microaggressions, and a lot of other things. And let's be honest, I mean, it really doesn't matter what your race or your gender or anything is, you are probably at some point in this business going to have an uncomfortable discussion with a donor. And wow, shouldn't we be preparing our fundraisers better for that inevitability? And I think that's, Bob and Bob, I'll stop talking to let you go. But I think, I think like, wow, if somebody had told me when I was 23, just given me a little bit about how to handle situations like this, I sure would have appreciated it. So I think that's maybe what Bob and I are trying to do a little bit, is just help out folks out there to deal with some of these situations.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And I don't have a lot to add about the origins, but I think this is one of the topics that we're really excited to be talking about. And we sort of wonder, like, why isn't this talked? Why isn't this mandatory training for everybody in the field? Because every single one of us has our stories, right? And we joke about them, and we laugh, and we might, share some of them over a drink, but often they're not funny, and and we sort of laugh because that's the only option that we've had. And no one, it's always just been, well, that's just part of the business, right? Or that's just this particular donor. So, for us, this is, we're sort of proselytizing this. We want as many people and trainers and consultants and HR departments to really make this a part of just training 101. Like, we're doing it, but we'd love to see as many different people doing it as possible. We think it's a really important topic.
As you were talking about that, a couple of things struck me. One that we can dig into now. The other one, maybe we can talk about even later or now if you want. And that's, you checked, of course, AFP in 2018 and all the things that happened after 2018. And I know that you both will have experiences personally as well as with your client work that you can cite as examples of things that you've navigated and then helped others to think about and navigate. But AFP itself has gone through this navigation. So I don't know if you want to touch on that or not. Of course, many of us are thinking about the trip to Toronto, and a lot has changed on, for the big chapter up there. So any thoughts about maybe how this topic has taken root or not, and whether or not we are in a position where we can start having discussions where they're more fruitful and they're happening all the time instead of just once a year?
Go ahead, Laurel.
I mean, if I could be so bold as to say that we did submit this this session for AFP and did not get accepted. So it will not be at AFP International this year, but we tried. And we are kind of, and that's not a dig on AFP. I know they have lots and lots of sessions proposals that they get submitted. But I think one of the other things, I think to your point, Jay, about this not being just something that kind of is a one-off at a conference. I mean, we actually have been working with the ACLU over the course of the last year and a half, and it is now our navigating power dynamics training is now required for every ACLU fundraiser across the country. And and I think we are curious to see like what it would look like to work with with CASE or with, I actually have also done this for Cal State Fullerton. All of the fundraisers at Cal State Fullerton had to go through this, whether they felt like it was relevant to their work or not. So again, I think there is a piece of this that is, I would personally love to see like, how does this topic, to Bob's point, like just become the same way that learning how to build a table of gifts is like fundraising 101. How is navigating power dynamics like fundraising 101 topic, right? So I think that's interesting to me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that it has been widely adopted. I mean, it's not that I don't see it and I don't see folks offering it, but I can't say that the conferences that I've been to lately that this is a major topic of conversation. I think for better or worse, it kind of gets lumped in with the DEI conversation, and that's can be fraught. And I think folks are, I think there's a little bit of a backlash against that right now, unfortunately. And I think folks are reluctant to talk about it, and I think there's a wariness about it. I don't think we see this really as I mean, it certainly intersects with DEI, and it certainly has aspects of it that are important part of that, just as people of color. But I think it's women. I think when you did your AFP Congress workshop, Laurel, which I was able to sit in on, people were talking about it in a wide variety of manners. Disabled. I remember one woman saying, I'm blonde, and so people just think I'm not that smart and they don't take me seriously. So I really see this as a topic that affects everyone and really should be, talked about more widely. But I do think it maybe suffers a little bit from, just reluctance to kind of wade into it, because it can be difficult. It can be difficult conversation. It brings up uncomfortable topics. I think the way we teach it is really very experiential. Like, we have slides, we talk about it, but a lot of it is conversation with folks and really going through scenarios and asking questions and asking folks what they've done in their own space and how they've handled things. And so whenever you kind of have those open conversations, I think it can be challenging, and people can say things that may be uncomfortable, or different people may be on different points in their understanding of how this works. And so I think there's a wariness and a reluctance, and I think but I acknowledge that, but I do think it's still really, really important to have these conversations. And I think we've learned over the last few years, like, some of the guardrails that need to be up to make sure that these are productive conversations and useful, which doesn't guarantee anything. I can certainly cite uncomfortable conversations we've had while talking about difficult donor conversations, but I would say that the balance of those conversations have been really, really excellent. And even the ones that have gotten a little fraught, I think everyone's walked away having learned something and had a different way of thinking about this.
If you don't mind, I'd like to ask also maybe what the reluctance comes from institutionally. I mean, individually, we sort of get it, because there are some people who might not want to, we all sit in our own experience, but calling attention to that experience, especially if it's not physically identifiable or something like that, then it's like the quote dumb blonde reference I thought was actually pretty interesting, because everybody has their own experience, but it's not always a visible experience. The disabled community talks about this a lot. But institutionally, it's a little bit different, right? I mean, so organizations can or cannot choose to do what you have done with ACLU. and or what AFP has chosen to do on occasion through various venues. What do you think the impediments are institutionally to making this kind of a core 101 gift table kind of conversation?
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts, and Bob, you probably have more to add. I think there's two things that jump to mind immediately when you ask that question. I think the first obvious one is gift acceptance, right? If a donor this conversation by nature brings up the fact that there may be values misalignment with some of our donors. And if I am a fundraiser and I have a negative experience, an inappropriate experience with the donor, and I bring that to my organization, it inevitably raises a question about, is this a donor who it is appropriate for us to be working with, taking money from? And sometimes it escalates to that point where we have seen organizations say, no, it is not worth putting our fundraisers at risk of harm to get money from this donor. And we are clearly, this incident or several incidents with this donor demonstrates that we're not in values alignment with them. And I think for some organizations, it's given them an opportunity to sever ties with donors who maybe are misaligned in values. But I think not, this comes up in every time we do one of these sessions that, how big does the gift have to be before the organization pushes back on whether or not values misalignment is a reason to not take a gift, right? And that is you thought that power dynamics with just individual fundraisers was a thorny issue. We're not even talking about gift acceptance from misaligned values donors, which is, you think about what's going on in philanthropy today and the demands that donors are putting on organizations that may or may not be aligned with their institutional values, right? Like, that's a real thorny topic. And so I think some organizations are hesitant to put this out there because it potentially raises issues of gift acceptance. I think the other, maybe less kind of big broad one, is just that I'm not sure our managers are trained very well to handle these conversations with their staff, to create brave spaces that allow their staff to come and have these conversations and feel equipped to support their staff in managing them. So we have found in our training that it's as important, if not more important, for us to do dedicated manager training around kind of working with your staff and creating spaces for your staff, as it is to just provide the information directly to fundraisers. I don't know, Bob, if you have other things to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add really is that there's a like the actual training itself and the delivery can be fraught as well. So there's sort of like the big picture of it, and then there's the actual like implementation of it. And so when we first started doing with the ACLU, and we did a lot of planning, and we thought about this a lot, and we talked with a lot of their affinity groups. They have a variety of affinity groups within the organization, and we had a lot of conversations with their people of color and philanthropy group and lots of other groups within that organization as well, just to like, what are we not thinking about? How do we do this? You're talking about a space that is people with different identities within that space, and different experiences, and how are things that people are going to say are going to hit different folks is going to really vary. I mean, recently I was working with a group, and somebody said something that was perceived as ageist by some folks in the room, and it was kind of okay in the moment, because I don't think anyone thought it was that upsetting at that time, but it turned out someone was a little upset about it, and it kicked off a little bit of some issues outside of the within the organization. And so an organization has to make a decision about, like, are we willing to take all this on? To Laurel's point, are we willing to ask the question of ourselves, are we willing to accept all gifts? And what are we, what are the lines? And and what do we do, right? I think I see somebody in the chat is talking about, like, where are the lines? I think it must be the Tony Myers, but I'm not sure. Hey, Tony. But right, there's going to be different lines, and how well defined is that? And so you, just by virtue of having this conversation, right, you open up a lot of different things, and you hope that people will call folks in and not call them out. but who knows, you know? And so we recognize that, and we think it's still important to have the conversation, but it is fraught. It is difficult. And I think a lot of what we've learned in doing it, though, is there are some things that you can put in place to make this less likely, you know, for things to be less likely to happen. There are guardrails, there are policies, there are things you can think about in advance that will make this a little less fraught, because the situations are often quite predictable, right? Like if we were all to sit down and say, when is it likely that there's going to be a difficult donor conversation? When is something likely to come up? We kind of know what that looks like, right? That's when you're alone with a donor or in a car. It might be at an event. It might be, you know, while you're, you know, at their house. You know, these are predictable times when we can say, hey, this is a situation where something difficult might come up, and because we can anticipate it, we can have the conversation in advance, and we can, and in fact, that's probably, I would say, is our biggest takeaway from this, is just to have the space within your organization to have these conversations on a regular basis. You know, hey, Laurel, how would you like this situation to be handled if it comes up? How do we as a collective want to handle this situation when it comes up? It's going to be different for different organizations. It's going to be different for different people. But just having the space to have that conversation is super, super valuable, because, again, you can kind of predict the kinds of situations where this is likely to come up. And just by acknowledging that and having those conversations, you can make this a little easier to have. I mean, I think, Laurel, we've noticed that with the ACLU, the kind of conversations that we have with them across the board are very different now that we've been doing power dynamics than the conversations that we have now. Like in the beginning and now, like we've really seen it kind of, you know, it's a pretty progressive organization and culture over there anyway, but I think we can really see a real increased level of comfort, I think, in having these conversations. So, you know, but I think folks from the outside looking in have to, you know, think about it like, do we need this problem? Do we need to be thinking about this? You know, is this something we're willing to take on, of all the other things that we have to take on, considering, you know, it's a difficult fundraising environment right now also.
Well, and I think, Bob, to piggyback on that, like, are we willing to have the conversation with our fundraisers that they are allowed to make decisions for themselves about certain things? I mean, I will never forget when I did that very first session in Toronto. I had a young woman come up to me after the session, and she said to me, my boss would fire me if she knew I was here right now. Right. And I was like, I was shocked. I was like, we're just having a conversation, right? But that was the culture. And I look at other, you know, one of the things we talk about in our sessions is that there may be things that aren't organizational policy. Like I have actually had Cal State Fullerton, I'll use as an example. After we did our one of the results of us doing our initial sessions with them is they actually created a policy that no development staff was allowed to drive donors anywhere, and they actually created a like an Uber fund, so that when a donor needed a ride somewhere, instead of a development person going and picking them up and driving them alone, they could offer them to take an Uber, right? Because it had come up during the sessions that was to Bob's point, like a common time when uncomfortable things were happening, or people being driven by a donor, like an older donor that maybe didn't drive very well, and then they were, you know, and so, and, you know, and one of the things that has come up a lot is home visits, right? And I always joke about, you know, the last home visit I did, when the 90-year-old man answered the door in his boxer shorts, was the last time I did a home visit, right? And I said, I'm done with that. I'm not putting myself in this position anymore. And, you know, I joke about it, but it's true, right? But some organizations may not be willing to allow their fundraisers to make those decisions for themselves. They might say, like, no, you get too good of information about people's, you know, motivations and interests and you know, whatever, by doing a home visit, you have to go, right? And so again, to Bob's point, these difficult donor situation conversations open up a lot of other cans of worms, right, about what kinds of situations people do and don't feel comfortable being in, and whether organizations are comfortable letting them make that choice for themselves.
I know that people are probably going through in their own heads, doing a little inventory of those uncomfortable situations and wondering, to the point that Tony made in the chat, whether or not these cross a line where notification of HR is important. So there are a couple of things here and to discuss. And before we discuss them, I'd like to encourage people to feel free to use the chat, but also the Q&A. And I believe in the Q&A, and I wish I could tell you how to do this, so I apologize in advance for not knowing. But you can anonymize your questions. So if you'd like to raise something that you want to be a part of this conversation, but you don't want to identify yourself, we completely respect that. I would not mention your name if I read from the chat, but other people may see your name. So if you wish to use the Q&A and anonymize, please feel free. Or if you want to just be out there like some of the folks have, we welcome that as well. You spoke a moment ago, Bob, about guardrails. I love that expression because it's being applied to lots of things now. AI comes to mind, but certainly all these things we've talked about, from Me Too, but everything else, the racial reckoning, et cetera. And but I wonder sometimes the way you've discussed this, if this is more like we need driver's ed than guardrails. Because when you've started these conversations, let's say with clients, maybe even with the early stages of ACLU, did you have to sort of give people some rules of the road before they even got in the car this conversation, so they felt like they could open up a little bit without being so vulnerable that they could be themselves harmed, or that they couldn't, or they felt able to say things that were on their mind without fear of retaliation, because maybe out of their own, sense of self, they didn't know how others might respond to those statements? How do you establish how to drive through this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's challenging, and I think to be perfectly honest, Jay, I think we're always evaluating it, and I think it varies from group to group. We've gone back and forth about having sessions that are people of color only at times, because there may be things that that people of color only want to raise with other people of color, just because there's just less explanation that has to go on. I think at times we give scenarios in our power dynamics, and I think at times we've had to, be more directive and be like, here's what's happening in this scenario, as opposed to, what do you think's happening in this scenario? I think having again, like having that call people in and saying that explicitly rather than calling people out, and really being clear to assume good intent going in, and just establishing the fact that this is going to be uncomfortable. Expect discomfort. We say that very explicitly in our introduction to power dynamics. Like, this is potentially a really uncomfortable conversation. I think most of the time it's actually been great conversations, and Laurel and I have learned as much as anybody in teaching this. We really picked up quite a few. And I think Laurel and I also, we try to share our own experiences, because we think it makes it a little easier for other people to share their experiences. And I think that's been a big part of what's made it successful, is our own willingness to talk about not just things that have happened to us, but mistakes that we've made. Like, I share that, years ago at an organization, there was a donor who, would get a hotel. We would have an event at the same place every year. He would get a hotel room up in, next to that venue. And he would proposition young staff, and we knew he did that. And I had conversations with them. I would say, look, you don't have to take this, accept this, but, looking back, as soon as Me Too happened, I was like, wow, I really should have handled that much more proactively and differently, and I don't know that I did anything differently than anyone else was doing at the time, warning them to stay away from him, and being really clear that they certainly didn't have to put up with that behavior, but, I don't think that was the correct way to handle it in that situation. I would handle it very differently now. So I think we try to be honest about our own failings in this area, and our own reckonings, and our own, I think it's been a real journey for us, as Laurel teases me about, when we first started doing this. I'm like, well, I don't have any stories, Laurel, like, this hasn't ever happened to me. And she's just like, come on, Bob, let's get real. Of course, of course this is happened to you. So I don't know if you have any other guardrails that you would add, Laurel.
No, I think that's all right. And to Bob's point, it really does depend on who we're talking about and who we're talking to, and kind of the structure of the session, and all of those things are important. And I think the other thing that it's kind of looking at the Q&A, the two questions that have been popped into the Q&A, and I think one of the things we also try really hard to help people see is there's no one right or wrong way to deal with these situations, right? There's so many things that are dependent on the situation itself, what's behind the situation. It depends on you, right? We talk a lot about understanding kind of your strengths and weaknesses in handling difficult situations in general. I always say that for better or for worse, my go-to is humor. Like I'm almost always if I'm uncomfortable and don't like something somebody's saying to me, I'm almost always going to find a way to one-liner quip it and walk away, right? Like it's kind of my go-to. Other people, if they tried to make a joke, it would land terribly. Some people, and I think about like this first question about, if somebody's being verbally abusive, cursing at fundraisers, yelling at them. Unfortunately, I've seen that, right? Like I've been in those situations. And again, how you deal with something like that so often comes down to you personally, right? Some people will just go right back as aggressive right back at them. I am the most conflict averse person in the planet. So I'm probably, if nothing else, just going to say something like, this doesn't feel appropriate. I think I'm going to walk away until you've calmed down a bit, right? And I'm just going to exit the situation because I'm not going to deal with it. But again, this is why these are hard conversations for organizations, because a lot of staff, if I'm in a situation where a donor is yelling at me, I'm out. I'm not dealing with that situation. But there are so many fundraisers who have not been given permission by their supervisors or by their organizations to walk away from that. And that's what we need to do something about in this industry, is we need organizations to very explicitly, and managers and supervisors to very explicitly say to their staffs, if you feel harmed, uncomfortable, like you are being put in an inappropriate or uncomfortable situation by a donor, you are allowed to walk away. And we never say that. And I remember the first time we ever did our first session with ACLU, and I talk about leaving, right? Like you're allowed to leave. Like if I'm in a donor, and I've left, right? I've one situation where the donor just wasn't hearing me and wouldn't, and I kept trying to change the subject, and I kept doing the like, okay, well, I know your time is valuable. Let me get to my next, and he just kept at me. And finally I just kind of looked at my papers and I said, you know what? I think I've asked you everything I need to, and we can wrap up early. I'm going to go ahead and go. And before he said anything, I just stood up and I walked out the door and I was done. And I felt like I could do that. Like I had permission to do that, but so many staff don't. And I remember what I was getting when we first did this for ACLU. I remember one of the biggest pieces of feedback I got overwhelmingly was the number of people who followed up with us and said, Laurel, no one has ever told me that I could leave. And I'm like, this is a job. It's a job. It's yes, it's important. And the missions and the visions that we work for every day are so important to us, but none of this is worth you physically, mentally, emotionally being harmed. So I guess to all of you out there, Laurel gives you permission to leave, but I think, it warrants having a conversation with your managers and with your organizations that you're going to be supported if that ends up happening.
Yeah, because to go back to the HR point, this isn't so much of what we've been discussing isn't about breach of the law, but about policy and whether or not you're supported. And it's one thing to say, if you feel uncomfortable, you can leave, although it sounds like not many organizations are really doing that. But let's imagine they are. There still has to be a way you can go back to your colleagues, let's call them our colleagues, and say, I've had this experience, so therefore I exercised my agency. I left a situation that was deeply uncomfortable, and feel protected within the organization. So is that another part of the thing that you've gone through with organizations to help them not only navigate how people have agency, but organizations need to protect their employees when it comes to HR, even if there has not been a violation of the law?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And I think, again, this is where having the conversations becomes really, really important, because most organizations do have an HR policy. Like, there's some things that are just very clearly sexual harassment, and you have options. I think this gets more into like, it's not a clear HR violation, or it may not be an HR violation of some kind, but it's still it's still an uncomfortable donor interaction. It's still an inappropriate donor interaction. And I think that's where we have to have the conversations, because let's say I'm a 22-year-old fundraiser and coming in, and a donor is yelling at me. Do we want somebody to step in and help that donor, to help that young fundraiser? Well, the instinct is yes, right? But maybe not, because maybe that, the way that young fundraiser is going to be treated going forward and within the organization is a question. How they are going to interact with that donor in the future, it has an impact on their career potentially. And so it gets into a messy area where you really do have to have the conversation within your organization, and say, hey, Jay, if this happened to you, how would you want me to handle it? And I think Laurel and I have found sometimes people want folks to step in and do something about it right away. And sometimes people are like, no, this is my career. I can handle it. I don't want you stepping in. Because it does have that impact on your career potentially. And depending on who we're talking about, right? Like Laurel's point a little ways back, like money really does factor into this, right? This is, if a donor who can, make a big effect on your career or have a big impact on the organization, is the one that's doing inappropriate things, it puts us in a really challenging position. And so we really do have to have these conversations and have an understanding within our group, within the organization, about how we want this handled. And we need to revisit it on a regular basis as situations change, as the organization evolves, as staffing evolves. We make sure that we're checking in with folks, see if anything has changed, people have changed their minds in some way. And so I know, with the questions in the Q&A and the chat, there's no, I'm sure everyone would like to, in this situation, do this, in this situation, do that. This isn't really that kind of topic, unfortunately. It really is going to be based on your understanding within your organization, and really, again, having those conversations. I think if Laurel and I were going to boil this down, it really is to, you have permission to leave, give your employees permission to leave, and have conversations with your people, and have a regular space for them. And if you do those things, it doesn't solve every problem, but it's going to solve a lot of them.
Yeah, I've seen a couple references to that word permission. I wonder, I know that the words we choose have power. And I wonder if maybe another way of potentially thinking about this is an understanding between staff, partners, and colleagues who are in positions of, supervision, where if there's an understanding about what is appropriate or not, and then a staff person acts on their own agency, then it's not a matter of necessarily requesting permission. Sometimes that word will run afoul of folks. So at least that's the way I heard it as you were discussing this, that we're not ceding power to supervisors, but we're rather just having an understanding. At least that's the way I understood. There's a part of this question, if you don't mind, I'd like to read it because others can't read it, from an anonymous person in the room, and what they see most often, because these things do come up a lot. And it's difficult because they are not, they're not in the law. Microaggressions are the greatest example of this, but I even like the second one even more personally. But anyway, they are what they see most often. Microaggressions from donors about complaining about not being able to understand my colleagues' accents from other countries. And we've got people right here in this discussion who are very familiar with different parts of the world, are living with people from other countries in their own families. So we know this one. And then the other is donors who use outdated and problematic language about the people we work with and demanding to go see the work in a very white savior spectator sort of way. I'm just interested in your reactions to those things and then how you've navigated those issues, because those have risen in a big way, at least in my mind, in the recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100%. These are things that we hear a lot in these sessions that we do, and things we hear a lot in other sessions we do around values-aligned fundraising, anti-racism and fundraising, and things like that. And I think that, you know, I think there's different answers if we're talking about how do you approach this from an organizational level and how do we approach this from an individual level. I think and I think it's important that we acknowledge that difference. We actually have a little graphic that we talk about, and this idea of being an advocator or a kind of a decision maker, and what the difference between being what we call an activator and advocate. So, you know, in any given situation, you are either an activator, you're a decision maker, or you're an advocate. Maybe you don't have decision-making authority, but you can advocate for your position or your feelings. And sometimes as individual contributors, we are activators. I'm an activator in deciding if I'm going to get up and walk away from a donor visit, right? But I'm not necessarily an activator when it comes to whether or not my organization then continues to take money from that donor, right? But I can be an advocate, right? And I think our organizations have to let us be advocates and listen to us in when those decisions are being made. I think similarly with things like, you know, just decisions that we make in terms of how we talk about our work, how we tell the stories of the people who are engaged with our work. There are things that I, as an individual contributor, can decide how I'm going to talk about the folks that receive our services or who are in our programs, and a way that the organization is going to support me in doing that. And I say all of this because I think one of the other things is we can't expect everyone to respond in the same way, because one of the things that's come up a lot in our work is this idea of like donor education. And if it's our job as fundraisers, if I have a donor who is, you know, using problematic language, who's being inappropriate, is it my job as a fundraiser to educate them as to why they're being problematic, right? And I think it depends, right? Like, I don't, as a person of color and as a woman, like, yeah, I want people to be educated and I want people to make progress on their own DEIB journeys, but it's not my job to sit there and tell you like, well, you know, Bob, you really should, and that's a terribly uncomfortable position for me to be put in anyway, right? It's hard enough for me to deal with a microaggression or have somebody say something inappropriate to me, much less to then be like, and now I'm supposed to educate them about why that was the bad thing, not the right thing to do. And, you know, but some people might relish the opportunity to educate a donor on why that was not appropriate, right? Particularly if you are from you know, we find that white folks are actually more comfortable talking about donor education because they're talking to people who look like them, you know, like it's a different way, right? So anyway, I say all this because I think that there is a difference between how I'm going to respond to a donor doing something inappropriate versus like feeling like I have to educate them about why this isn't the right approach for them to take. And I guess I would just say that there's not a right or a wrong answer to that. I think, again, we have to be true to ourselves and to what feels right for us as individuals, but our organizations also have to understand when we may not want to be put into those positions. I kind of rambled there for a minute. Bob, help save me here, Bob.
No, I think those are all really good points. I mean, I think the thing that we can do as organizations, though, is to have values and have clarity about those values, to take the burden off of your fundraisers, off of people of color, or whatever identity you may have and maybe facing a difficult donor situation, and have clarity about what those values are and how they're actionable and what they represent. And so we don't use white saviorism language and here's examples and here's why, so that when it comes up, we can say, hey, you know, when you said this, this, this violated our, this doesn't align with our values, and here's why. Gift acceptance policy and codifying some of this stuff. A lot of this stuff can be systematized. It doesn't solve everything, but if you have the processes and the understandings and clear sense of your values and what they mean in terms of your actions as donors, then you can point to that, and it takes the burden off of you. And I think also, I'm on a number of boards, as you heard in the beginning, and one of the boards that I'm on, we have really clear expectations around, like, we're not allowed to talk when a staff member is making a presentation. We have to wait to the end, and that was to avoid pushy board members kind of jumping in, belittling staff members, saying inappropriate things, all kinds of dynamics, just in terms of like the staff and the nature of the people on the board. And so a solution was just wait until the end, and then you can ask questions. And I, as a board member, find that immensely helpful. Like, okay, great. This is the rules. These are the guidelines. I'm just going to wait. And that was going to take any number of dynamics off the table. And so I think there are things, again, that we can kind of anticipate and think about and see coming and come up with a solution to them. It doesn't solve every problem, as I've said, but it does give us, the more that there's policies in place, the more we can point to those policies, as opposed to an individual fundraiser kind of having to figure out how to navigate it on their own in that moment or right afterwards.
Well, and I think too, Bob, we talk so much about just like creating spaces and teams to share stories. One of the things we always, our friend Sheena, who does this work with us, we always talk about the fact that like Laurel the next morning is so clever and so witty and knows exactly what to say, right? But like Laurel in the moment is like, right? Like somebody says something to me and I can't respond, but the next day, oh my gosh, I think of a million really clever and wonderful things to say in response, right? And I think like, why can't I be Laurel in the future in the moment? And I think, but some of it is just practice, right? Some of it is just, I think about I just had this white savior conversation with a board member recently, and it was only because we've been doing these sessions and I've heard other people talk about it and I've heard other language that I was able to kind of say, well, one way to think about it is this, right? And I kind of walked through the situation with this board member, but if I hadn't been doing this work, right, if that came out of nowhere and I hadn't really had these conversations before, I don't know that I would have been able to be so on the spot with my response to that. And so again, just hearing other people's stories, saying, hey, what if I said something like this, or just practicing can be so valuable. And I will just say too, in our sessions, just to respond to Tony's comment too, like in our sessions, we kind of have a little tree, that like decision tree that we walk people through for responding in the moment to these situations. And there's two choices, right? You can stay or you can leave. And I think, and if you stay, you can stay and try to move the conversation onto a more productive space, or you can stay and face the situation head on, right? Again, you have so many different choices in this, but I would never put it on someone what they should do, right? Like those are your decisions to make. I'm going to empower you and give you some ideas and options and ways of doing any of those things. But what you ultimately decide to do in a situation, I think, is so dependent on you, on the situation itself, on any number of things. So just wanted to make sure that people knew that our only recommendation is not to leave. In fact, that's probably typically the recommendation that is it's a pretty extreme response to these situations. But yeah.
May I ask you both? This is another difficult question to answer, but you referenced the power of donors, and one of the issues is I think you said, Laurel, that we may have the power to leave or to do what Tony said is another option, and you were just describing, which is to assert. But even if we have an agreement within our office about what we can do with ourselves, and that we feel protected in doing those things, that doesn't necessarily change whether or not the organization chooses to do business with these people who might make us individually or collectively uncomfortable, people who might be misaligned with our values, assuming back to Bob's point, that we even have a value statement that has been agreed upon by the organization. Not to mention having, you know, these policies and procedures, which I'd love to see for every organization. But the reason I'm asking about this is, what power, if any, do we have or should we have as individuals within organizations to say, you know what, this has been my experience, this is why I think this kind of donor is not right for us? When can we assert our power as individuals within an organization to say, this is what our value statement is, and this donor is not right? They got to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bob and I would probably both say that organizations should always create space for that kind of advocacy. I think that we have to allow our fundraisers to have their voices heard, but we also have to be very clear with our fundraisers what the process of, my favorite Bob Osborne word, of adjudication is going to be for, you know, going through and deciding when we're going to sever a relationship. And you know, one of the things that comes up all the time in these trainings is gift acceptance policies, right? And lots of people have gift acceptance policies that say things like, you know, whether we'll take gifts of property or not, right? But very few gift acceptance policies talk about the process by which we will go through and determine if a donor is aligned with our values or not. And I think we would argue that that's a very important thing to have, not that says this is the black and white answer to it, but to Bob's word, the process of adjudication, of going through and saying, we have a committee that will decide this, and we will, you know, go through this process to decide. And part of that process should be that you're hearing from those affected most directly by the situation, which includes your fundraisers. So, you know, I again, I don't know that it's as black and white as saying, if this, and this happens, we stop taking money from a donor. But I think you do have to have a process that's outlined that says this is what we do, and we listen to staff.
And I would add, you know, just to respond to the chat, you know, I think, yeah, I mean, money, it can be really, really difficult, and that has to be a decision that's made, yet again, through that adjudication and through that process. And we may not like the answer, but I think that when people feel like there is a process of adjudication, that they're at least satisfied. They at least understand, like, we weighed what is happening here and the harm that's happening here with people's jobs, people's livelihoods, the impact that's going to have on their family, the impact that's going to have on our clients and the people that we serve. And we have made this decision, whatever decision that may be. That said, you know, we work with a number of organizations. We've worked with a lot of environmental organizations, I think, who've kind of gone through this. I think them in particular, just because of the nature of the origins of those organizations. And have they lost donors? I think overall, because of non-values alignment, I think they've lost donors. I think they've also gained donors. And if you look on balance, it hasn't resulted in any catastrophe for any of these organizations. And so I think we can be very afraid of, like, there's no way to replace this donor. But by being clear about your values, by being clear about this is what we're about, this is what we stand for, I think you'll find that you'll have just as many people join the organization and be excited about that and enroll in the organization because you are in values alignment with them, than have folks leave. But it doesn't take away that one situation, that one donor who is giving $500,000 to your $1 million organization, you know. And then I think, again, it has to be a process of adjudication. So these are difficult conversations, and so there has to be the process, I think, and a way of weighing the considerations, as opposed to, again, saying, you know, this is our theme. Like, there is no just one answer, but there needs to be the processes and the culture to allow these questions to be answered.
We just saw, of course, two major university presidents not long in their tenure removed, and there are different opinions about that, what happened and why it happened. But I think that there's almost universal agreement in our field that part of that has to do with donors exerting influence. And so in those cases, though, it was merely the threat. So is it the threat? Is it our fear of what might happen rather than what actually does happen that sometimes causes us to not want to even talk about these issues at all?
Yeah, look, we've lived with a scarcity mentality in the nonprofit sector for as long as the nonprofit sector has existed, and I don't know that, you know, I think we're making small incremental progress in putting our missions and our visions and our values first, and putting how we fund those missions, visions, and values second. But we're not there yet. And I think until, everyone is there, we're always going to be in this push-pull. And is that where we want to be? Absolutely not. But there's also realities to, to Bob's point, if I'm $1 million organization and you fund half of my organization, what options do I have? But I also think that there has to be middle ground, right? And I'm just not sure we're always very good at finding the middle ground either, right? Which is, maybe we don't sever ties with you, but we do make progress in helping you see why this is problematic, right? And I don't know that applies distinctly in the university cases, but I think in a lot of these situations with problematic donors, if we're not willing to not have a relationship with them, what is the other follow-up that is happening with them by the executive director or board members or others who maybe can go have conversations with them about their behavior?
If someone sitting in on this session or watching it later still wanted to have that kind of easy 1, 2, 3, what should we do? Are there some things that as general suggestions that you would have for organizations that want to start entering into thinking about having these conversations and building some kind of guidelines for care, I guess, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, I mean, I would say, Bob, I'm sure you have more to add. I would say reach out to us. Like we've done enough instances of this, kind of big and small, and everywhere in between. It doesn't have to be a huge drawn out process. We have sample guidelines. We have decision trees that we've put together to help people think through these scenarios. We have decision trees for how you might follow up on these scenarios. We have some resources just generally about power dynamics and what it means in fundraising. So, I would just encourage anybody who's interested in discussing this further just to reach out to me and Bob.
Yeah, and I would say, the thing you can do, independently of us or anyone else is have the conversations. I mean, I think that's really the important thing. I mean, in doing these, having these conversations, because again, the way we do present this and teach this, it really is a conversation. We have some outlines and guidelines around it, and we facilitate that conversation, but each conversation is a little bit different. But I think that the takeaway really is to have those conversations and have a common understanding within your organization about how these things are going to be handled, and be clear about your expectations if you're a supervisor, for your staff. Be clear within the organization about that you have your fundraisers back, and until we get a fundraisers bill of rights, which I think is out there somewhere. People, we'll see when it comes out, but you can make your own and you can create it in your own space. So I think carving out that space, I think, is really important. And I think this is going to be, I think Laurel and I, when we teach these kind of topics around DEI and difficult conversations and anti-racism, when it comes to fundraising, it's like, this is an ongoing conversation, and there's no right or wrong answers to this yet. I think we're all working on what's best practice. So I guess we would encourage all of you to be part of that conversation, and I think together we'll come to some kind of working understanding.
That might be a beautiful way to begin wrapping up. I do want to just add to what you said, that there are drafts of a fundraiser's Bill of Rights, and people can reach out to you, I'm sure, for many things, but maybe that's one of them, or we can include something like that in our follow-up email. So if you're interested in sharing this conversation with other folks, a recording of this is being made right now. Please be on the lookout for an email so you can share it with colleagues, because uncomfortable conversations sometimes need a little oil to get them moving. And this may be just that lubricant that's required. But I want to thank both of you very much for having this conversation with us. And I know it's just skimming the surface, but really, really helpful. How can people find you both and learn more from you?
You can reach us both at theosborngroup.com. That's really the best way. We have tools, we have a blog, and you can email us there at mail@theosborngroup.com. But we're on social media to some extent, and you can sign up for our mailing list and keep in touch.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you both very, very much for this. I really do appreciate it. And I know that everybody else here does too. And please do share this with others, because we can't have this be just a once in a blue moon conversation anymore. And do stick around. You'll see a little QR code in the next couple seconds. So grab your phones and you can learn more about the rest of this series. You can also do that, the Philanthropy Mastermind series on social and over on our friend's site at DonorSearch.net. Under the resources tab, you'll see everything coming up soon, including a session for See a Free Credit this Thursday. And maybe we'll see some of you up in Toronto. Whether or not we have this session, we can certainly have this conversation. So let's have it up there too. Thanks, everybody. We'll look forward to seeing you soon.